thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Happy Black History Month from Oldways. And first, I'd love to talk a little bit about, what we're doing for our Recipe Month celebration for Black History Month with Oldways. So, yeah, thanks for joining. Every single week this month, we have been posting a new recipe, and if you've noticed, there's been a theme with them. So for this one's theme, it is on ancient whole grains. And so the recipe that we have featured is the banana millet porridge. And so you can find that on our Instagram page where we posted it, but you'll also find the blog post on our website. And so everyone, please feel free to try it out. I recommend it for breakfast. It's super delicious. And it's an ancient, African-based whole grain. So highly recommend. And yeah, try it out. Take a picture of it. Post it either on your Facebook or Instagram page. And then you'll be entered in a raffle to win, free gifts and things like that from Oldways. So, we're almost at the end of February, and of course, it's the shortest month of the year. But super excited for anyone who wants to tag along and join the challenge. And you can find that blog post on our Instagram in our bio, the link, and follow it there. And also, I forgot to introduce myself, so let me tell you who I am. My name is Sarah, and I'm the Heritage Diet Curriculum Coordinator for A Taste of Latin Heritage and A Taste of African Heritage. So, yeah, let's get started with the conversation with Thérèse Nelson. She's absolutely fabulous. I'd love to give a brief introduction, if that's all right, to the audience. So, yeah, let's welcome Thérèse Nelson. She's the founder of the Black Culinary History Organization. They have their own website. They've been developed since around 2008. And it's really great because this site, it offers many ways of connecting chefs, and cooks and historians of, African heritage. And it kind of connects them through the African culinary diaspora and highlights the work that they've been doing. So it's really good for, building a kind of legacy and, really having a nice foundation and, recognition in Black history and African foodways. So if you haven't heard of her website, get logged in, get tuned in. It is awesome. And she also has, what you can find on there is a range of different things. So there's the blog post, there's the recommended book list, there's video collections, there's podcasts. So everything that, to learn about what's going on, this is your girl. Thérèse is the person for that. So, highly recommend. And we'll also, share the website from this video once the interview's done too, to tune in. Great. So, yes. Oh, I also want to talk a little bit about, we talked about the website, but also, notice how I say chef. Teresa is definitely a chef. For one, she is a writer, book author, and she's been featured in many publications from Eater, the New York Times, and, also her famous podcast, Food Desserts. And that was created in collaboration with Black Food Folks and also the Wheatstone magazine. And then I think they're sponsored by Tulanti. So just want to make sure we have those in there. And she's also a member of many organizations too. So let's name a list of them off because, you can never name off too many accomplishments of the Black woman. So she is a member of the Women Chefs and Restaurateurs, a part of the Southern Foodway Alliance, a part of the Equity at the Table, the International Association of Culinary Professionals, and the Culinary Historians of New York. And she is also the cook in resident for Taste. So super exciting to have you join us today. And please let me know if I'm missing anything. But I just want to make sure that we have you covered.
That was very generous introduction. Not familiar with SFA, and yeah, I feel like, but yeah, that's plenty. I feel like you sort of over the years, you do this work long enough, you sort of try to be in community with organizations that and right relationship with your intention. So, yeah, sort of fingers in lots of different pots, but yeah, that's plenty.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, let's get started then. I was just wanted to ask a few questions and, as however time sees fit or whatnot, but super excited to have you on board. First, I would say, you know, starting with the questions now, I think, the thing that's been buzzing the most is your podcast, Black Dessert. So we know that, that was in collaboration with Black Food Folks and Makes Sense Magazine, but I was just curious that I realized that it was launched originally, I think it was March 25th of 2021, right? Was the
Hmm.
first aired show. Great. So
Yep.
I'd love to know, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, no.
Okay, perfect. I would love to know, how did you begin to become a part of this project and, like working with your team, how were you able to, I believe you collaborate with 13 different chefs. So how did you pick and choose, which chefs you wanted to do the podcast with? And also, how did you formulate the common themes of each of the episodes? Like, I thought that was so cool when listening to them.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Well, it really was a Black Food Folks project. I think summer of 2020, lots of organizations, corporations were sort of looking for ways to be in community with Black folks. And Black Food Folks, started by Clay Williams and Colleen Vincent, was really sort of an answer to a lot of community building they'd already been doing. I think when lockdown hit, we sort of felt this usefulness for Instagram, and we started to have these kind of conversations. And brands like Discover, and Intuenti sort of wanted to be in community with Black food folks in a way, as a way to sort of be the conduit to food-based businesses that were valuable. So they did 2 rounds of grant. Um, they sort of offered grants to community members who are doing interesting work around the same time, but Black food folks has always sort of been in the business of storytelling, whether it be through clothing work, through writing, all the folks who are in community sort of come at food from different areas. And so the 20 money was a really interesting time to think about desserts. I think there are areas of food and food culture that we sort of disregard or maybe don't sort of pay enough homage to. And so it was a really interesting time to talk to and about Black pastry chefs, Black pastry creators, sweets creators. First season was really sort of a reaction to all the folks we had already been talking to. I thought a lot about setting the ground for thinking about what it means to be Black in pastry. Usually, I mean, again, like thinking about COVID and the ways in which restaurants change. A lot of pastry chefs in restaurants are the first thing to go. It's the first like luxury item in a restaurant setting. And so you will find a lot of pastry chefs immediately out of work or out of work in ways that savory chefs were not. I also thought a lot about just the stories that were just naturally there. The first season was really sort of about this linear story we wanted to tell about all of the ways in which you prepare yourself to do this work. Talk to value-added folks, talk to hardcore restaurant chefs who are going through traditional training, talked a lot about education. And so the topics or themes naturally sort of progressed from the natural questions I had about what it really took to be in pastry. We just finished season 2 a couple weeks ago, and I think season 2 is really a lot more esoteric. We were thinking we already set the tone with the 13 chefs and their careers, and so we're thinking a lot more about the function of pastry. Really asked some interesting questions about nostalgia, the sort of ephemera around desserts and sweets, and the kind of memory and emotional connection that sort of area of our foodways have. So it was really interesting to sort of talk to fewer people, but folks with different lens on pastry. I'll talk to anthropologists and historians and writers, to some chefs as well, but sort of thinking about ideas about chocolate production, thinking about Black past, like Black repast, joyfulness and sort of mindfulness in the ways in which we engage pastry traditions. So I don't know. I think the themes are organically crafted. I'm thinking about season 3 now. Whetstone Media has been our partner from the beginning. I think, folks not paying attention to Whetstone, the collective. They really should be. Steven Satterfield has created this beautiful magazine that then also translates into his podcasting platform that is bringing really interesting global food ideas to us all. So it's really dope. Network, you can listen to all of the Whetstone Radio Collective series wherever you get podcasts. But our little series is 6 episodes a season, and it's really sort of this jewel box of small ideas around pastry.
Yes, and for people who haven't watched them, they're really in depth. Like they can typically be around like an hour long or so per episode. Well, especially for the later seasons. But that's so exciting to know that there will be a third season too. Super exciting. And yeah, like you were talking about some magazine in the media, they are always serving visuals. Like we follow their Instagram page and I've seen their magazines and it's so beautiful. So what a lovely collaboration. Like it's kind of like three, really people who know what they're doing that are just like on this project. So that's no wonder why it's so fabulous. Everyone's really tuning in. Were there any like special highlights from this series that you've been doing that you want to kind of talk about, or like, was there anything that really stood out to you? Because I feel like every episode, I don't know what to call them, podcast episodes, yeah, like every kind of session, the topics really vary, like they're very different, but also super insightful. Like it's like I'm learning so many things I've never heard about, like when you were talking about the chocolate, when I heard about that one, the chocolate one, it was like, wow, that's awesome that they're doing kind of like a farmer alliances and like, creating a network and, really using that to empower the local communities there. And, it's just really cool. So has there been anything recently that's kind of just, you're still thinking about, still reflecting on, where you're just like, wow, that was something I never knew about beforehand. And, it's something I want to look into more.
I will say that I wasn't necessarily surprised about most areas that I was interested in talking about. It's more that I had, especially for season 2, a lot of things that sort of came to in season 2 were seeds that were planted in season 1. So I talked to a friend named Erica Davis in Jacksonville, who's a chocolatier, really brilliant pastry chef, and talked to her in season 1 kind of about her career trajectory, what it looked like in the early parts of her career to sort of try and navigate in this really particular, like late 80s, early 90s culinary world. And I've known her for years. I've watched her sort of develop her chocolate brand. And so the seeds of the episode that we did in season 2 that really focused on the global South and the sort of ecosystem around chocolate was really planted in questions that I was able to talk to Erica about that had nothing to do with thinking globally, but certainly sort of sparked this idea about wanting to talk to folks in the global South, but folks who were dealing more on the ag side. I think the series, the thing that's been most surprising, and surprising may be the wrong word, but most gratifying, is that folks really just want to sort of share their stories. I think in all things, I think the platforms that you Oldways and Taste of Heritage in general, I think so many of us see the value in archiving stories. And it's one thing to know these stories for yourself. It's one thing to sort of be immersed in history or immersed in context all the time, but you do realize how cloistered we are, and so sort of how lucky we are to have work that focuses so clearly on these topics. But you realize that when folks are listening to some of these themes, that they aren't part of folks' everyday lives. And so a lot of work I'm interested in, and the beauty of the series has been that these stories are archived forever. You go and try and find a digital footprint of all these conversations, even just in rudimentary Google searches, that we have intentional spaces that really sort of highlight these stories in ways that are accessible to folks is valuable. I certainly am joyful and gratified by the degree of publishing that's happening now, the fact that we have so much more primary material that gives us historical context for a lot of work we're doing. But you sort of have to meet people where they are in terms of their entry points to a lot of these things. And if, an episode that I do that talks to or gets you connected to farmers in Trinidad and makes you think maybe more particularly about um, the chocolate you're consuming, leads you to think more critically about chocolate production, then it's a starting point that is so much context, so much more, deeper content available to you. But if it's a starting point that sparks something, I think that's valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of these like topics that you get into, it's kind of like you really get into the geopolitical kind of like realm of, wow, I never thought of, I love that we're now in an age where people are getting more conscious of the consumerism and, just what they're using their money towards. And, of course, like food waste and everything, because food is medicine, but I think it's really nice to see more people are becoming more aware or even like asking those questions to look into things like, something as simple, like as simple as chocolate, like how many people actually pick up the label and, read it and say, oh, this was from, where was this made and how was the production? And, like, were there children involved? And, like, were there any labor crimes or, penalties going on here just for the production of, what I'm enjoying for a cheap, affordable price? Who's getting paid in the end? So that's really cool that you're, able to have these conversations with people and just really deep dive in. And that's what I like about this podcast series. So
Well, I appreciate that.
absolutely. So now going a little bit off topic, but just talking a little bit about yourself. So I know you got your education in the city of Charleston, the original chocolate city. I'd read in one of your blogs. And you also had talked about, so I know like in your, kind of upbringing and in your learning in Charleston, you learned a lot about, like cooking techniques and, kind of like in the kitchen. But I heard that, you didn't really get super focused into the African diaspora foodways, or, it's not focused, but you didn't, you learned so much from one of our advisory board members, Dr. Harrison's book, High on the Hog. And so that was like a whole nother awakening for you because it's like you visually saw this gap in the culinary scene and you were like, I want to go and research more into that. And that was kind of one of the books that just opened up that doorway for you. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about, how, and now there's a docuseries, which is awesome, but just, like how did this book like really, kind of expand your culinary experience in the kitchen also, because like you looked into the African diasporic foodways, but, how did you also bring that into the kitchen, and throughout your journey and, how did it shape that?
Sure. It's a really interesting question. I would say Charleston certainly has been really important to my training. I'm from North New Jersey, and in retrospect, Black history, Black colonial history was all around me in a city like Newark. I think lots of Black cities, a lot of major Black cities, Chicago, San Francisco, etc. There's entrepreneurship. There is, hospitality is a driver that propels cities. So in retrospect, in plain sight was history all around. But in terms of culinary training, there's a very particular sort of story that you told sort of in professional training about who's credible, who's a uniquely American chef, especially when I was coming up. And it was counterintuitive to what was innately, like you had a sense that this story didn't quite make sense. That if we're talking about the historical examples of Black agency that are completely left out of the story to be told about the ways in which American gastronomy, American culinary arts kind of developed, you start to have to ask yourself more serious questions. And I would say that Charleston for me was a lesson about cognitive dissonance, the ways in which we are willing to accept kind of narratives that don't make any sense, sort of maintain status quo. I
Mm-hmm.
think Dr. Harris's book certainly is important to me. Dr. Harris is a lot of our North Star. She has had language that has given us context for this language around Black foodways, so diasporic foodways. Excuse me. Hana came 2011, so I've been doing my work for maybe 2 years at that point, and was really interested in trying to figure out a linear timeline to sort of think about the building of American food and sort of the Black hand in that story. Excuse me. And so I mean, at that point, Psyche Forson's book, Build a House Out of Chicken Legs, was 2006, I believe. Fred Opie had written a book called Hog and Hominy, I think was maybe '08 or '09. There were books, I mean, Vernon McGrosner had written Vibration Cooking in '72, Doc, there, all this is to say there was content available, but no one had put it in plain English, plain language, in a way that told you a different kind of narrative, the narrative story. Dr. Harris has this way of claiming like a lyrical narrative that cuts through a lot of academic noise and plainly tells you the truth about the topic she's sort of trying to get you invested in. And so it was important in that way. I think I'm sort of interested in how people are receiving the docuseries because, one, the series is half of the book. So, you sort of talking about half of a story that is much deeper, much richer than what's presented. Beautiful theater to me. I love theater. Everybody involved, think it's wonderful. But I guess I'm troubled by the fact that the book is 10 years old. And so, just going back to the book itself, the bibliography alone will take you down a rabbit hole that will give you so much more context. And so I wonder sometimes about where we get primary reference from. And I think that is so imperative that we look to books like How and the Hog, the kind of like academic labor that is put into constructing a book like that. Think about, Michael Twitty's Cooking Gene. There are all these ways in which the available literature, available scholarship is giving us very clear clues about the truth of our story. And so that's a very long answer for your question, but I think at the end of it, my real focus is the usefulness of that information in serving the work you do. There's a way in which knowing the truth straightens your spine and requires you then to be a better, more engaged steward for work you say you do. The world of food in general, from a cultural endeavor to a capitalistic sort of, business perspectives to just lived history, all requires knowing the truth and starting from a place that is honest and useful. So I don't know. All I have to say, while Dr. Harris's book is critical, I think so. There's some recent books that are taking her ideas, taking the necessity of broader conversation to a whole new level. Psyche Forson's Building a House Out of Chicken Legs is another book that's foundational, but her new book, Eating While Black, is asking us questions about the ways in which we engage our relationship with American food, American dining, from the socio-political to the practical, sort of community-based activism work that needs to happen. Like, it sort of asks you to deputize yourself, especially as a Black person, with improving the ways in which we contextualize our relationship with food. So, I don't know. I think it's just time for us all to start asking, whether you're in food or not, asking better, smarter, more engaged questions about the kind of food world we want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you touched on the point of, like cookbook authors where it's like it's kind of like, some of these books that you had mentioned, they're setting the foundation or, they're citing the references. So it's like you can look back and know that this was going on in the past, and now I feel like the newer arena is like, what do we do next? How do we act on that? What are our next steps on food activism, and how do we get more involved? How do we take ownership of African diasporic foodways? So I think that is really awesome that we're starting to have more of these conversations. And I mean, there are plenty of books that are being published right now and that are actually like gaining the recognition that they deserve. So on the point with you on that. And yeah, thank you for, actually going along and answering that. Yeah, one of the things I did want to mention, since we're on the topics of books, I heard that you were doing an essay or going to be featured in one of the books, Serving Up Essays on Food, Identity, and Culture in partnership with Zoe. I was curious. I know they're doing the crowdfunding right now and everything, to get it started. And
Yep.
we're already on the list. But I was just curious, what can we expect from, what you'll be adding to the book, like your feature? Have
Sure.
you?
Yeah, I definitely have. I'm sort of working on it now.
Oh,
She's always asking us a lot of questions about um, really sort of so talk about your relationship to food. That was a really simple question, but I think depending on the space you occupy, you answer it profoundly differently. And so she's got this collection of folks globally who are gonna talk about their personal relationship with food. And I would say that the thing that I was sitting with, and she asked like almost a year ago at this point, but I think, sort of we all were in the midst of sort of processing COVID, processing, sort of shifts in our careers. I think lots of people are in a very different place professionally than they were, 2 years ago. For me, I think the question was really more about reconciling the professional life I've given 20 years to, and my personal relationship with my own health, my own sort of food consumption, just everything about the ways in which I personally engage with food. Um, I realized, taking stock in the ways in which I was living my life, that those were two very different relationships, and I don't think that we ever give grace to folks who do this work professionally enough to sort of contend with that. We sort of there was a conversation I think that was happening maybe when I was in culinary school, but there was this sort of awakening to the idea of um, the negative statistics around hospitality work, specifically culinary work. Rates of when you get hit with the rates of suicide, the rates of depression, divorce, all these factors that contribute just by the nature of the work. And I think, certainly over the last few years, I think mental health, trendy words like self-care are all elements that we sort of cling to or try and be more intentional about, but I don't think we ever really speak plainly, honestly, about what that looks like. I mean, there are organizations, there are groups that are trying to do that work more clearly and more directly, but for me, I really sort of want to talk about what long-term neglect looks like, what work that requires you to pour into serving and feeding other people. What happens when you don't have enough left for yourself? What happens when you don't sort of take the time to really prioritize your own well-being? Because it's a very seductive thing to work in a space that has very clear parameters for success, very particular ways in which you get to show up and be creative and fulfill. But it is in a lot of ways, I think, steal something from you in terms of centering yourself or centering your well-being. And so I was sort of processing my own stuff and figured if it was resonating with me at the time, it might resonate with someone else. So that's what I'm working on for that.
Oh, that's exciting. Thank you for sharing. That sounds really exciting, and I love that you're talking a little bit on like self-care, because I feel like definitely in the food industry you see a lot of cooks who are being actively drained because it's a very tasking process, and at a point it can you have to kind of not reinvent yourself, but kind of just like energize yourself back into the notion of cooking, because it is a lot of effort. You know, you've got the rush, you've got people over your shoulder, so that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I guess like you know, what was I thinking of? This wasn't even one of the questions. It was just about, you know, kind of the tasking environment because I wonder there must be studies on that, you know, like cooks in the field and like the depression rate and the suicide because it's absolutely alarming and a lot of people don't really know about it. Like it's something that isn't really you don't really see on, you know, the magazines or articles or it's not really talked about, which is really unfortunate. So that is something that I think deserves a lot more light. And, you know, it's just, oh my gosh. Sorry, I was thinking about something. It was about, you know, getting, I'll go back to it, but actually I'll go on to the next question. I'll come back to it, but it was something off the point that you were saying. So love the curated recommended reading list you did with BEN Books and War.
Sure.
We're curious if you could just like name a few for the audience, but also, you know, what kind of led to you like picking the books that you chose? Like, you know, um, were these like foundational books that you like kind of throughout your career have kind of picked up off your shelf and you're like, this is my favorite book and I want everyone to read it? Are these some new findings that you were just like, I came across this, read it in one day, was amazing, added it to the list? You know, like how did you go through, you know, curating this recommended reading list?
Sure.
And yeah, just talking a little bit about that.
So the read list has been the part of the site since the beginning. I would say um, a really good friend of mine, Vonnie Williams, who's a really beautiful food writer. I think she's based out of Houston now, but maybe a year and a half ago, she helped me redo my site in terms of the aesthetic look. But the site in its current form, for the most part, in terms of content, has been the same for about a decade. Um, the first couple of years of the site was really cathartic for me. It was a place where I was sort of processing my own sort of progression. I was consuming lots of new information, was building very small but mighty community of folks, you know, one person at a time. Like meet somebody dope, they become part of the community and we sort of engage in one another. We exist on Facebook as a group, a little over 5,000 members in that group, but the site has always existed as a resource. I would say the early days of the reading list in particular was absolutely what I was reading. I don't put things on the list that I haven't actually consumed. Um, the lists have been pared down a little bit. You know, as a category, I think we might have had, you know, 8 lists at some point. We sort of combined a couple to sort of pare them down because there was a lot of overlap. But the list really is a function of starting point. I'm interested in if you have very limited reference point, or even if you are just, you know, are well versed but curious and want something new to read, wherever you are on the spectrum of starting point, you should have a place to sort of to engage. For a long time, I would link the books to Amazon because my thought was, I want you to be able to immediately purchase the book. If this title is grabbing you for whatever reason, get into it and look at it like, I gotta read Hound of Hog. I wanted it to be an active way for you to sort of go and get the book immediately. Um, the partnership with BN is really over the last couple of months. It's a relatively new shop. Davenport Sisters are really concerned with and engaged with food and food culture. One of the few bookshops I know of back on that focus primarily on food. And so the partnership was really, when we did the site a year and a half ago, we switched all of the links from Amazon to independent booksellers. And it was a great opportunity because it was, you know, it made the list more intentional in terms of who we were telling you to connect to. But I didn't have personal relationships with the bookseller out of Atlanta that we were connected to. And it wasn't a bad thing or a good thing. It just, I was sort of thinking if we could take the intentionality a level further. The Davenports are so serious and intentional that it was just a natural partnership. So we switched all links over. I would say 95% of them go to BM just because they have the books available. I think our partnership going forward will be blind spots or titles that they don't carry that I think they probably will be able to carry. And there are a lot of titles that I hadn't been familiar with that I was able to add because they had available. Just in terms of resources, I think that uh, I thought about what it was like in culinary school, feeling disjointed and disconnected from content or availability content. And you're also talking about a time where we didn't have the internet as prolifically as we do now. And so I really just always wanted the research section, whether it's the books or recommendations for podcasts or videos via YouTube, etc. That all these platforms that exist that have all kinds of shenanigans also has, hundreds of hours, hundreds of books, all kinds of creative, contextual information available to you at a fingertip. And so, yeah, the list are personal recommentions that will get more contextual. I think we're working on now a feature to deep dive into all of the books. So that'll be a blog feature soon. I will say that I don't connect to, I'm interested in putting books up that are modern scholarship that you should be purchasing to support the writers. There's a site called Feast Afrique, Ozo Soko out of Canada. Brilliant anthropologist, writer, blogger. Her site is Kitchen Butterfly, but she started a site called Feast Afrique. And Feast Afrique is really sort of the things that my resource list doesn't do. Feast Afrique is super dope. It's all digital and online resources. Lots of out of print or, sort of just obscure, really diasporic titles that you wouldn't have access to purchase. You can get free and almost all online via the site. So, access to archive and libraries that have this content. She links you directly to it. I think it's like over 180 titles. So I feel like it's a companion to what my resource list does. It's a site that I go to constantly, and it's just it's this rabbit hole. Once you start going down, you really can't stop.
Oh yeah, no, that's so funny because that's what I've heard that literally from Tony Simpson Martin, one of our other advisory board members. She was talking about that. Like it's like once you open up these books, like because I feel like Jubilee, the Jemima Code, her books are just like so many references to all these other cookbooks. So it's like you open it and you're like, okay, this is the start of the rabbit hole. Now I need to read this book to refer back to what she was talking about. And so definitely agree with that.
A side note, Tony Simpson Martin is a scholar and a writer and a journalist who we just need to lift up way more. What the Jemima Code did first was to put into a collection books that some of which you wouldn't be able to get in print, but certainly books that tell you through proof that the whole problem with Black history in multiple forms is that the ways in which we contextualize and sort of vet and find credibility in facts is so connected to European standards and standards that require written proof. And very often the story we tell about Black culture is, about lack of proof. And even though we know in our spirits, even though we know in our culture, we have references for all the truth we need, but because it's not sort of credible in this very arbitrary way, we are able to be dismissed and overlooked, etc. And what she was able to do through the books, through the sort of beautifully collected, gorgeously presented, essentially long form annotated bibliography, will say, like, okay, you want written proof? Here's written proof. You can't the beginnings of this nation's relationship with food without seeing Black agency in it. And I don't know, just something so beautiful and intentional and proud about the way she presents our culture that is always just affirming and gorgeous. I don't know. It's one of those books you gotta just have on your shelf, your counter, just to feel like it's a touchstone.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. It's really like that tabletop, and they look like a gorgeous tabletop, book that you would have. And it has everything. Like it was just so eloquently done where it's just like everything's sourced, it's cited, and it's there. There's the references, there's the author, there's the year, there's the date, there's where you can find it. Like it's
That's
just all there, put in, and like you said, put into those arbitrary standards of, because people will come back on you. And it's funny because we did an Instagram live, and she was saying when she did, I think it was the Jemima Code, like one of her first books, she had to go to several different publishing houses to get it published. And it's like, when you look back at it now, you're like, wow, like the audacity, like, wow, the nerve. Like, so it's definitely love key players like that, and so happy, to, really bring that sort of, recognition, but also just like admiration and everything of being a part of the African culinary foodways. Like you are also up there, girl. Like we love what you're doing. So,
yeah, but yeah, I think also, um, it's very easy to take for granted the degree of struggle that the Tony the Martins, the Jessica Harrises of the world, sort of laid for us. It's so, again, like the beauty and the connect nature of publishing right now is super dope. To watch your friends, to watch folks who have been putting in their dues and putting their work, produce gorgeous books that are telling the story of this particular moment is wonderful. But don't take for granted that 10 years ago, it was hard for people to get their work published. It was hard for publishers to have that, sort of proof, the proof of concept, essentially. And that it is not lost on me that these folks are still very much with us, very much thriving. Dr. Harris has new books on the way. Like Tony's working on a memoir. It's just there are ways in which we should certainly be joyful and hopeful about new writers coming out, but also be looking to the trailblazers who are still working very kinetically right now.
absolutely, just actively out there. Like, yeah, when Twitty brought out Rice, I was like, wow, that was quick. It was like, man, people are really bringing out these books. Like Brian with, Afro Vegan and the Black Food. I was like, this is awesome. Like, everyone's in the field really doing their thing. And I love that people really took the time to, kind of find the silver lining of what was going on with the pandemic and really just get super engaged with their work and, produce excellent, pieces for the community, to be honest, for us. So super excited and loving it all. I'm trying to think of I have several other questions, but there was actually, I'll hold that a little bit later, but this is a question that typically I don't know, I don't really like asking because, not everyone really knows their relationship to the African diaspora. But if you feel comfortable, I would love to ask you. But if that's totally fine, if that's something that you would want me to get.
So you asking what I consider my relationship to the diaspora to be?
Yeah.
Sure. So like I said before, like I started my site because I was profoundly reckless in the early parts of my careers about sort of how I was presenting my own culture. I didn't know enough. I think like I am Black by way of North New Jersey, by way of Gladys, South Carolina, and I can only trace back my family's story maybe 2 or 3 generations. And so the starting point for my family's cultural references is very much the American story that is about displacement and about sort of placemaking, right? So much of the migration story we talk about is about sort of having home and leaving to find a new place. My grandparents are part of the second wave of the Great Migration. They came to New Jersey, worked in hospitality, worked in service back in the days when any sort of work in food or hospitality was considered domestic work. But I would say that professionally, culturally, I don't have this really robust, profound, earth-shattering sort of food story, right? Like food was, lots of times growing up, we were food insecure. Lots of times, like the ways in which um a group of going to state like New York, certainly Black entrepreneurship, Black foodways were around, but it was also a story of being in community with other cultures. And so, um, when I was coming to food professionally, I don't know that I sort of cognitively saw that there was going to be room for whatever my story was. I also didn't see a lot of power context, what that could look like professionally. I will say that I always thought about entrepreneurship and thought about catering precisely for that reason, because when you can restaurants, especially working with other people, you serve it in service of somebody else's vision, in service of somebody else's sort of cultural point of view. And if I was ever going to figure out what I really wanted to say as a chef, I felt that catering was going to be one of the only places that I would be able to do that in my lifetime or relatively quickly. But when you start asking those kinds of questions about what you want to say, not just for us, right? Like not just within our culture, but I think anybody who is serious about cooking and serious about the cultural work of translating your ideas into an edible form, that language, that sort of wealth of information that you use to inform that language you create has to have more depth than this surface level curiosity. I think across cultures, you can taste inauthenticity, you can taste confusion, and can taste lack of rigor. And I think I was guilty of not really starting from a place that had any real roots. So I started asking questions, right? I started to sort of think about what it meant to be Black in this country, what it meant to be in the majority of my career over the last 15 years has been in New York. What did that look like? Terroir is important to a chef, right? Where you are situated geographically. Being in a place like New York, you are in community with lots of cultures, right? Everybody kind of cross-pollinates, brings something interesting to the table. For me, professionally, I would say my culinary story is an American story by way of honest history. That I bring the African diaspora, her ingredients, her pantry, into my kitchen as primary. So, the fats, the seasonings, the spice cabinet that I started from is certainly a taste of diaspora, but it's through training that is classically French. It's through experiences that are complicated but global, because that's what I'm in community, where I am, professionally, geographically, in community with. But it is all through my very Black palette and my very Black experiences. I think it's interesting to sort of ask that question in this moment, because I think so many Black chefs are starting to ask themselves that question more seriously. And it's really certainly one if you come from a cultural references that have a lot more history and context available to you. I'm thinking about my folks who are, geographically coming from other parts of the diaspora and planting themselves in the American context. You bring with you whole stories, whole, sort of wells of reference that give you a certain kind of legibility, a certain sort of possibility in terms of the topics you can genuinely and credibly talk about. I'm never going to appropriate one of my kinfolk from the Caribbean story. I'm not going to appropriate West Africa. I'm certainly going to appreciate West Africa. I'm going to see these flavors as valuable. I'm going to see the correlation between them. But I would never appropriate those stories, because I think that part of the beauty of this moment is, what does it look like for you to tell me who you are? We skin folk, right? But I don't know your story. I see a good friend, Simeon Hall, amazing chef from the Bahamas, who is well worth it, asking people to be hyper specific about what they mean when they come to the Bahamas and want to taste the food of that country. How many islands make up the Bahamas? How different are the Mangos Island? And so thinking a lot about get so hyper specific about from where you start, right? Enrica Williams just jumped on here. Enrica is a chef out of Mississippi. She brings Jackson, Mississippi wherever she goes around the globe. What does it mean for her to start from a place that says, I'm from this place, from this terroir? What does it look like to translate that food other places? That is about a common base vocabulary. I think for me, that's kind of what I'm interested in, right? Your question about diaspora is really about what's my toolbox look like? What references do I draw from that inform the food I cook? And I think that's the primary and most critical question you can ask yourself as a chef. But for so long, Black chefs would never ask themselves that question specifically, intentionally, and willing to sort of get complicated and get messy about what that answer looks like. We're comfortable with this very canned answer. That's why we lean so heavily on soul food, right? Soul food has this very clear language. It has a very direct legibility to people to understand what that well of references is, but it's not the whole story. I think part of the problem has been is not to find a point in it, but it's a very easy thing to lean into an easy trope. And I have no reference point, no interest in worrying about what white folks do or wondering what folks outside the culture are doing, because we can't control other people's recklessness with our culture. That recklessness only happens when we aren't as protective and don't sort of pick up the baton of stewardship in a way that requires folks to contend with our culture in more intentional ways. So much what you're talking about in terms of what Oldways does or what other organizations like yours does is give folks a fair and reasonable starting point to think about cultures. You can't ask people to be more rigorous and more engaged with your culture than you are. And if we perpetuate narratives that we know aren't true, know aren't the whole story, but are super easy to sort of, replicate and translate, then we're complicit. Honestly, I started my site because I was complicit. I was sort of in this space that was not starting with what I knew to be true. How do you sort of ask somebody to be more knowledgeable about your own culture than you are? That's just ridiculous. And the cultures that we see, other global cultures that have maybe more legibility in the marketplace, maybe we feel has more respect in the marketplace. I think those examples are from cultures that see themselves as primary and require more of the guest who's engaging with that culture from the starting point. And so I just think there's something so valuable about this moment where we see chefs taking that responsibility as stewards more seriously.
Absolutely. And that was a beautiful answer. I think really taking, ownership in your own narrative and your own relationship to the African diaspora and kind of building off that. And I loved how you even pushed into Oldways. That was nice. But it's like, organizations like Oldways and, other nonprofits, we're just like the starting point, like it is kind of like, here is a little bit of foundational pieces that may help you discover more of your own personal journey, and you can build off that, and that's what we say all the time. We say, build off of this, use this as a place just to get you started, just to, really, because we'll even refer, like other books, like here's some additional information, here's a recommended reading list, here's how to get more into the topic, whichever you are interested with, go down the rabbit hole and take off, So I think it's really important that, every person in the, just anyone, but really, people in the culinary field, especially, the Black community, that we start building our own narrative and, really go against those, tropes, like you were saying, and, kind of provide more. It's really nice because it provides more proof against those negative stereotypes. So, and that's something that our curriculum works towards too. Like we just did a academic journal where we talk about the effectiveness of the program, because what we're trying to say is, African foodways can be healthy, like our ancestors ate it, and it definitely was plant-based, seasonal, because you can't get meat everywhere. So that's really important part of our mission. I think it is great that, everyone is seeing the importance of it, and, starting to recognize that. So absolutely can agree more with you. I feel like every time you say something, I'm just like, yes, I agree, but I actually agree.
Yeah, and also doing work that is in service of that idea, right? Like so often, I think, especially for chefs, I think that people forget that we are engaging in business, right? Your work, the primary function of your work is to, serve people, but serve people for money. And to sort of know the work of, I mean, I see Christy Brown out of Seattle just jumped on here. Christy opened a whole gorgeous restaurant in the middle of the pandemic. But the work and the intention behind what she was trying to build it predates this moment. And so, it's the struggle of keeping your doors open, the struggle of, having dozens of people you're responsible to in terms of the financial investment and sort of people's, they giving themselves over to feed this restaurant space. And that's very different work than, feeding, your feeding your community, feeding your own ambitions, like all like to be able to compartmentalize all of those facets of what it takes to do this work, with some degree of longevity, some degree of balance, is all so complicated. But to have spaces like Communion that are also so serious about intention, so serious about baking in those little bits of context and history into the DNA of what you do, it takes some of the stressful part of knowing that your work is in right relationship with your intentions. And I think that so often the capitalism gets in the way of clear and maybe more ethical, more sort of spiritually aligned intention. The restaurants we love and go back to, and the ones that we see stay viable so long, are ones that I think start from a place that considers all of those elements as integral to foundation. And so just watching folks like Christy operate and thrive is affirmation about what's possible, I think. But I also just think that, I mean, so again, so many chefs who we're in community with globally are just ask themselves better questions and have resources like Oldways available to them to sort of feed into, I don't know, their stewardship.
Yeah, absolutely. And going off that into another topic, sorry, I just wanted to
No,
get this question in real quick, but we know that, you touch on legacy a lot, and, kind of restoring and, being sort of like a gatekeeper to, history. And, I'm not saying it's only you. There are many people, who are actively doing this work, in the African culinary foodways. But I guess, since we're having this conversation, I wanted to ask you, how have you continued to, focus, energize, and inspire the next generation of, Black talented youth in the food industry? And, I'd love to know, what sort of, with your active engagement, like how are you engaging with the younger talent out there within your field?
So it's a really good question. It's one that I'm always very mindful of, particularly because of the feelings of what I know of how I felt when I was starting. I think I personally reject this idea of gatekeeping because I think that it implies a power balance that is not something I'm particularly interested in engaging in. I think information democratizes any sort of gates or any kind of choke you want to have around engaging in mainstream spaces. Personally, I'm uninterested. I think that there are ways in which we can use and sort of be in community with mainstream publications. We talked about publishing a lot earlier. I think traditional publishing is profoundly valuable. I think the fact that Hound and Hog is on a platform like Netflix is important. I think that, traditional restaurants and the ways in which they earn money and all those things. I have no opinion about the ways in which people engage their professional careers, and I think it's all necessary. But the primary work I'm interested in has nothing to do with any of that. Everything to do with where you start from. You say you are Black, you say you are engaged in the hospitality world. What does that mean? What is your responsibility before you cook a dish, before you step out on, in your business, before you put your shingle up in whatever form you're going to put it up in, as a writer, as a historian, whatever area you want to occupy? What does that mean to you? What are you contributing? It's a very complicated question, but it's a simple question, and it requires an honest answer. If you are genuinely not interested in legacy and history or context, your work is going to look a certain way. I have no judgment about that. I'm not interested in telling anybody else how they should live and work in their professional endeavors. I'm saying that you can smell the difference, though. You can taste the difference. The difference is about the ways in which you build community, who you are in community with, who's feeding off of what, who are you in, who is in the circle of folks who are building up, informing, rising up a whole generation of folks. I take community very seriously. I don't think that we should be this one homogenous, single mission group of people. That's unrealistic. And it's also hella presumptuous, like to assume that we all have the same motivations and intentions. I think that being Black in this country means a lot in terms of a shared experience. I think that there are ways in which we have shared trauma, shared complications, and I think those are things that we can all commiserate around. But I don't think that that implies that we should all engage with this work in the exact same way. All that said, we can all start from a place of shared stories, shared practices, right? Me telling you my story about being from Newark, seeing culture through the lens through which I grew up is one thing. But if somebody I talked to who grew up in London, who grew up in is working in Tasmania, is working in Luxembourg, wherever you are in the world, that shared Blackness, that shared that shared foundation of global context, I think it should inform something about the way you engage your work. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? I think that is the primary question. I think that will feed every other thing. I think being able to find a binary way to decide if work is in right relationship with your intention is profoundly important in wherever you start from, wherever culture you come from, whatever. But it's the most important question. And I want to be in community with people who are asking that question on a consistent basis, are not afraid to be wrong, are not afraid to learn something new, but are also not afraid to be rigorous. Right? That if we are not, we see a kind of recklessness, we see a kind of disregard for history. Legacy only means, the power of legacy is that it gives you clues about where you come from. It makes you know that there's nothing really new under the sun. It saves you from the presumption of new ground being covered when there are literally people whose bones you stand on. How dare you?
Right.
That there is not, you aren't in spaces because other people sacrificed and put in work and gave you or opened doors for you. And so I guess I'm just saying all that to say that in this moment we are gifted with some really wonderful gifts of possibility, of mobility in ways that, so many of our elders were not privy to, and that it would be wasteful and ridiculous not to hold that, that gift in high regard and to be more beholden to being responsible to it.
Absolutely. And another thing that you didn't touch on, but I think that you've been influencing the youth population is through food writing. Like, I think you've inspired, I know that you've inspired a lot of food writers, youth food writing, because that is something that's not really it's a field, but I don't think many people know about it until you're already kind of in it and in that space. And I know that you did like a workshop once, and I saw that you did like
Sure.
kind of.
So I mean, personally, I'm a relatively new writer. I think that there is something inherently problematic about folks who are writing and talking about the ways in which modern food culture is evolving, who have no skin in this game. I think
Mm,
journalism is critical. I think that there are fine, amazing writers who have never cooked a dish, who have no reference, who tell beautiful stories that we need to hear. Historians that don't have any culinary. Dia Hodge just wrote a book that changed, that shifted the world called Afro Nostalgia. She works. Her academic discipline has nothing to do with food. The ways in which she, sort of engaged food was 100% cultural. Had no reference point for culinary. All that is to say that I think, for me, I think storytelling is the function of what we do. Certainly, as chefs, is on a plate. But I think that to be an effective storyteller, it requires a kind of, you have to fill yourself up with references. You have to fill yourself up with information to be able to be an effective storyteller. Your
mm,
food will be profoundly affected by it. But the more you start to engage and learn, right, you need other outlets for that information. I think that writing for me has been this really interesting and cathartic place that allows me to tell stories that just aren't translatable in a dish. As far as inspiration goes, I appreciate you sort of talking about any sort of perceived mentorship or whatever that I've engaged in, but for me, it's not. It's organic. I think
mhm,
that you should model the kind of um, engagement you want to. For me, it's about modeling the kind of engagement with folks who are further along in their careers that I wish I would have had.
mm,
When I started the site, I literally just looked up everybody Black I knew in food, who was operating in some way that, I thought would have information that I didn't have. I was in my mid
mhm,
20s. I literally knew nothing, and I was just trying to find and be in community with folks who could give me some information about why I was feeling the way I was feeling, and a sense of camaraderie. I think we underestimate the power of reaching out to folks. I think we are cloistered in this
yeah.
work. We are often, um, uh, there are ways in which we don't connect the folks by virtue of just time, stress, just all of the elements of the ways in which this work, you have to do this work. And the thing I learned so profoundly in my mid 20s was so often people just need to be reached out to. So many
Mhm,
elders who gave me so much good information because I reached out, and a lot of people just won't. You get intimidated by the fact that there's this kind of lore or aura, air, whatever around people, and you feel like they're in these rarefied spaces. They really aren't. The truth of the matter is that all of those barriers between you and someone else, especially when they're doing cultural work in the same space you are in, is that those barriers are arbitrary. They're constructed and they're learned. And the closer you connect to people, the more genuine you are, the more engaged people want to be with you. Um, I feel like I'm hard. I'm pretty tough on young people when they come and want. I mean, I'll say 60-70% of the emails I get through my website are from young people or their parents who are either going to culinary school or at the very early stages of their career. I
mhm,
will sit and have a half an hour conversation with anybody, but I require something of you before you have that conversation, right? Have you
mhm,
read the first two chapters of How and the Hog, right? Read the first chapter or two of Vibration. Come to the table with some degree of engagement, because what are we going to talk about? Like, the resources are right there on my website. You don't need my half an hour for that. What do you
mhm,
want to get out of engaging with folks? I think young people are profoundly more powerful than we give them credit for. Their degree of curiosity and insight is palpable. It keeps you honest. It keeps you um, engaged in ways that I think peer community sometimes gets very cloistered in nonsensical foolishness. I think young people are in search of trying to be better. I think that's infectious and is beautiful to watch, and is I think it just lifts up everybody. And so I would just say that for folks who are engaged in their careers, you never know who you're talking to. You never know the 5 minutes that you give somebody, some dope young person who doesn't necessarily know how to engage you properly, to come to them with kindness and to sort of model the ways in which they should sort of engage with you. You don't know how that would change somebody's life. There's some people who were so generous with me when I started this. Like, I sent this very confused, very rambling letter. And I keep it on the website to this day because I want to remember what those original questions were. But there were some people who were hurt themselves back then, who were Black chefs who I thought was in this rarefied air, which is so, so above where I was in my own development, and realized that they were not much farther along than I was in terms of their understanding of our culture. They were beat down and hurt and marginalized themselves. They didn't have the language for themselves to even see themselves. But there were also people who had profound insights that were so willing to share that with me. So I would just say that, first of all, you never know what someone has to share or teach you. And also that you just never know what you have to give somebody. And it literally could just be modeling kindness to somebody. It could just be modeling a correction in professional development they might need. And you just never know. And so I would say just a 15-minute conversation with an 18-year-old who is fired up and asking good questions about what it means for them to be Black in this work could change your life. So take the time, because it's, I don't know, these kids are brilliant.
Absolutely. I love that you touch points on, kind of taking the time to, give back and work with the youth, but also kind of pointing them, through your website, through the resources that you already offer, kind of pointing them in the right direction of, well, here's a starting point, and it's already here, it's available on the web, you just have to seek it. And, I think it's really important with the youth community to kind of, you still have that when you're younger, you still have that, drive against, of course everyone has it, but even stronger of, fighting against injustice and, just being an active voice, and you're observing so much information. So I think it's really important that you kind of feel comfortable with being uncomfortable and kind of getting yourself in those situations and asking, you may come off as sounding silly, or, it may sound a little strange, but sometimes I've noticed personally some of the silliest questions that I've asked have given me the most interesting and, the most wonderful answers, where, maybe what I thought was a silly question turned into a whole hour-long story with this person that I've been trying to connect with, who has, told me so much. So I think just definitely, we're in this year now, we all need to get ready to just get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
And also, not for nothing, I appreciate the question in terms of being a good model for young people. But honestly, what I found, especially over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, but definitely since the beginning of the site, was that as much as we sort of are so connected to and wanting to be of service to young people, we honestly need it for ourselves as well. I think that, among my peers, I think the conversations that I'm having are shifting so rapidly. Today, MoFad just had their ribbon cutting for the African/American exhibit, and to watch something like that come to fruition, certainly young people are going to be inspired by it. But there's so many working chefs who just are so beat down by the weight of doing this work in these conditions, and to have that sense of inspiration and aspiration and motivation in the form of a physical exhibit is powerful. I think we underestimate the necessity of inspiration and the muse moment of seeing ourselves reflected back to ourselves. And so I don't know, I just think that there's this way in which we sort of overstate or overcorrect by pouring into young people, but forget that we should also be pouring into ourselves. And that so much of what that intentional mentorship should and could look like is modeling behavior among ourselves, right? Modeling the kind of industry that we want to be building, so that they see reasonable, measure, intentional steps to sort of be ordered by. Sometimes it's not about heavy-handed, direct mentorship, prescriptive mentorship. Sometimes it's just modeling behavior in ways that give them clues about possibility.
Yeah, and how to behave. Yeah, absolutely. I know we've gone over on time a little bit, so I'd like to thank you so much. I did have one last question since we have been talking a little bit about, self-care and everything. It's just a fun one. But what do you like cooking on, or preparing for yourself on a typical night where you're just like, I just need to relax and this dish, whatever I make, is gonna make me happy. It's like my self-care. I enjoy being in the kitchen, prepping the ingredients. Like this is my go-to.
If I'm really in the mood to really cook for real, I would say either duck confit or some kind of braised,
Ooh.
braised something. I think braises are the truest test for a chef's ability. You have no place to hide. It's every ingredient you can get a taste. You can tell so much about the playfulness, the palate, the intention of a chef in a braise. I mean, it's nothing better than like putting these short ribs in the oven, just letting Jesus do the do, let chemistry work, and to come out with something that is so particular to your taste and patience. And but I don't know, for the most part, yeah, like I feel like I've been sitting with this. I'm trying to write this essay about there's a man named Esau Graham. I don't know how many people, you talked about Charleston earlier. I was trained, I spent the last 3 years of my training at Johnson Wells in Charleston. And Charleston Place Hotel is this jewel box in the middle of the city. And in that hotel was a restaurant called Charleston Grill. Still exists. Michelle Weaver is the chef now. She was sous chef back in the days when I was there. But there was a man there named Esau Graham. And he was this grizzled, geeky black man who had seen everybody come and go in that space. There was a chef named Joel Osteen. He was the Louis Osteen. Was like the sort of Charleston, sort of name back in the day. And he sort of in his book lifts up this chef named Esau. And I remember moving to Charleston, thinking about, going to this place and, oh my goodness, this iconic restaurant, and meeting Esau. And he taught me how to make duck confit in this way that I can still smell his particular blend of spices and everything. But that was a recipe that he had taught hundreds of people, hundreds of students who came through that kitchen, hundreds of chefs who would pass him over and be his boss, that he trained through that kitchen. Decades of service and keeping the taste of that restaurant consistent, intact all that time. And was never going to be promoted, was never going to. And every time I cook that dish, every time I think about the spicing of that duck, the butchering of it, every element of it that is a skill set that serves my career, serves my technical facility, coming through this man who was my first sort of clue about mobility and possibility in spaces I don't control. So I'll just say duck confit is really dope, but every time I make it, I think about Esau Graham.
Aw, that's so nice. I love that. And literally, I oh my Lord, here we go again. You had touched on the topic of, kind of Black mobility in the career field and the food. And where you're talking about how, he's been there for, decades or so at the same location, bringing in so much clientele, customers. Everyone knows their food, and he hasn't moved upward at all. It's just frustrating. Like it's nice that he's, his recipes are living on for other people, but it's really frustrating because this happens. You see many examples of this, and I don't know if it's like a thing within the Black community, but well, I mean, it is, but I mean, it's just like certain times, and I mean, there's definite external forces, but I think also the internal force of you know, maybe I shouldn't be moving up in this direction, or maybe I'm not ready yet. And it's just like, you are there. Like, everyone is copying off you. You're that good, you know? Like, it's like, you need that recognition. Like, who's your boss? Do we need to petition what? Because this is ridiculous, you know? Like,
Well, and
it's
I'll
so
be over, but
frustrating.
yeah, I know we're over, but I just want to say this part. Honestly, I'm really sitting with the story and trying to figure a way to tell it in a way that doesn't marginalize his lived experience, because I think
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure he's passed on now at this point. Um, but I will say that there's something in that telling of that story. Every time I think about it and share his story with somebody, I think a lot about the narratives that we put on other people, right? So
Mm-hmm.
often, I mean, it's one. I've worked in hotels. I had worked in hotels for the majority of my career before I started my own business, because it was this place where you saw a disproportionate degree of diversity that restaurants just didn't have, right? All that to say that his 40 years, he has sent his kids to college. There are countless Black women who maintain the garmentiers and page departments and all these hotels across the country and do this work for 40, 50 years. In New York, they unionized. There's a kind of mobility and security that they are able to maintain in an industry that tells you a lot about insecurity, about pay inequity. And so I would say that I'm struggling with this balance of telling the truth about being marginalized, telling the truth about sort of, you know, Esau's lack of mobility in the space that he occupied, but also this story there, I think about the negotiation of agency, right? So much of power structure we talk about it could be overstated and sort of misrepresented. I mentioned this guy Simeon Hall in Bahamas. A lot of work he's doing is asking serious questions about tourism and what cities like, I mean, what Caribbean cities that perpetuate and sort of are predicated on tourism and the performance of culture for tourists to maintain the financial stability of the city. Think about New Orleans. Think about Miami. Think about lots of other cities around the country that sort of understand the value and the sort of possibility and mm, the I don't know, the profitability of culture, and the ways in which you benefit from your participation, but in that relationship is also a very complicated, very sort of troubled reality. And so I think for me, more than telling a story like Mr. Graham, more than sort of piling these lived experiences into a trope, I'm interested in telling those primary stories, right? What would it look to hear from some of these women in particular, like those women who, you know, were in the page department of the, the Waldorf Astoria for 30, 40, 50 years, who, you know, make those hotels, make those restaurants, operations thrive, as opposed to telling a story as a homogenous prescriptive story of lack of possibility, lack of mobility. What if we make them primary in their own stories and they tell you about why they stay so long and what that looked like and how they process their part in this sort of mechanism that is really the whole of the hospitality industry. Stories that are right here in plain sight that we only have to ask honestly about folks' lived experiences. I think that that's a much more productive and respectful way to think about some of the tropes that we perpetuate by telling homogenous stories. I think
Mm-hmm.
hearing from folks directly is probably the more valuable way to go.
Absolutely. No, and that was one thing that, kind of connecting to that, several like new books that are coming out, I've noticed there's like a theme on, kind of Black excellence and, really focusing on the positivity and the attributions that, Black people have brought to the, American foodways. And it's just really nice to see. Like, it's so positive and it's really affirming, it's really inspiring. And I think, like so many people want to, kind of view the Black story and they see pain or they see struggle. And it's like we really need to, get on this path where we're focusing focusing on, the positive attributes of, our lineage and our ancestors, and really having that highlighted and shown through. So, I mean, definitely seeing some of the new works, like, for instance, like Black Food and, like these docu-series and other things coming out. I love it because it's like, we could read about, chattel slavery every single day and still learn something new, like we can read about all these other topics of oppression, but it's like if we focus too much on it, it's almost like we're manifesting, not focusing. It's good to engage, it's good to learn, it's good to, appreciate it. But I think also, we do need to, kind of focus also on, next steps, the future, moving ahead, because, those movements that happened in the past, they have all helped. Like every time we march, every time we go out and do something, we're not just doing it just to go for a walk around the park. There's accomplishments, there's goals set, and there's things being done at the end of the day. And, it is for our future, the future.
Also, just telling a more honest story. I mean, your point about like the trauma point of it all is 100% part of it. But I just think that I'm not even as concerned with the positivity part. I just want us to have more honest conversations. That your point about sort of like these uplifting stories is that they are joyful, sure, but to the power of sort of presupposing a kind of joyfulness, I think is also it gets to be a little tiresome as well. Just let people tell their stories fully, honestly. So much of the ways in which the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, I think, could be shifted if we just stop presupposing anything and just let people show up fully and complicated and, troubled and joyful and messy. But I think that in the midst of all that, you get to see people's full humanity. They get to be messy and complicated and wrong and able to change their opinions or whatever, but just, give ourselves room to tell our stories from where we really are firmly planted and not have to put anybody else's imagination onto how we, engage the world. Just let people be honest.
Yeah. And it sounds so easy, but it's really like opening a Band-Aid. I mean,
Yep.
It sounds like something so easy, but it's not, it's really a lot of inner self-work that you need to do before coming honest and truthful about things like that, like bringing that out and telling everyone is really, you're telling, it's like, taking off the Band-Aid and just letting whatever flow out, let it happen. So it's definitely a lot of interspiritual work that we all need to just, everyone is everyone, especially through pandemic, but just everything, taking that time and reflect. So self-care dish, yes, that was perfect. And that was actually my question that I had from an earlier, when you were talking earlier, and that was my question. It was your favorite self-care dish. So thank you so much of your time. You've been more than generous. This is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much. And, we will continue to follow your work and, keep updated on your new projects. We're following you on your social media sites. I think we're on your Facebook group too. So, yeah, we're in it for the long run. We want to keep in touch, stay connected, and we really enjoy, the work that you're doing and are listening to all your conversations. So, keep us in mind. Oldways, we are a friend, we're a cousin, we're here. So
That's right. That's right. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you. Your very kind words. But yeah, this is such a good time to be doing this work. And there's so many people who are just killing it right now. So it's all about celebrating this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, and happy Black History Month.
I got you.
All right. Well, have a good rest of your day. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Sorry, I'm so into our conversation with you that hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Bye.